Hi, Human Body Systems class. Here is our lesson on the cardiovascular system. In the background here, you can see a cute little heart beating away, getting ready to be transplanted into somebody. Okay, cardiovascular system, I'm sure this is review, but the cardiovascular system is made up of the heart, is the pump behind the whole thing, and then the various blood vessels that travel throughout the body. We have arteries and arterioles, which carry oxygenated blood, so those are going to be the red ones on our little cartoon diagrams like the one to the right. We have veins and venules, which carry deoxygenated blood, so those are going to be the blue ones on the cartoon diagrams, and then capillaries are the tiny little vessels in between the arterioles and venules where exchange of gas and nutrients takes place. Now remember that just because we use red and blue to show oxygenated versus deoxygenated blood in these cartoons, that does not mean that your blood is blue when it's deoxygenated. I remember being told that by an elementary school teacher once. So please remember, blood is always red. Okay, quick little bit about the tissue that makes up the heart. Here in this diagram, we have a cross-section of a chunk of heart tissue. The inside layer is called the endocardium. Remember, endo means inside, like endothelium. Endocardium is the inner lining of the heart. It also makes up some of the heart valve tissue. The myocardium is the thick middle layer. This is the muscly portion of the heart that does the beating. And then the pericardium is a little sac surrounding the outside of the heart to protect it from the rest of the thoracic cavity. There's a little bit of fluid. Let me see, can I get my little laser pointer? So there's a little bit of fluid in between the heart wall and the pericardial sac, and that fluid acts as a lubricant for the heart to be able to expand and contract and wiggle around a little bit as it's beating. So remember, that's kind of like the surfactant that you have between the pleural lining and the lung tissues that allows your lungs to expand and contract as you breathe. Okay, let me get my laser pointer here. So, review about the way that the heart is divided into chambers. There are 4 chambers of the heart, and the blood moves through them in this order. It goes into the right atrium first from the large veins that are bringing blood back to the heart from the rest of the body. From the right atrium, it flows into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, it's pumped out through the lungs and then brought back. The next chamber it will go through is the left atrium, and then from the left atrium into the left ventricle. So remember that we're thinking about the heart in the view of a person standing in anatomical position. So just like with the lungs on a diagram, right and left are going to be backwards. Okay, a little bit more about the valve system of the heart. So there are 2 main types of valves in the heart. There are atrioventricular valves, also called AV valves, and there are semilunar valves. Atrioventricular valves, anytime you see a valve involved in a vascular system, it's to prevent backflow of blood, because we really only want our blood flowing in the direction it's being pumped. So the purpose of the AV valves in the heart is to prevent backflow of blood between the atria and the ventricles within the actual heart. These include the tricuspid valve located between the right atrium and right ventricle, and the bicuspid, sometimes also called the mitral valve, which is located between the left atrium and left ventricle. And then as far as semilunar valves go, the purpose of those is to prevent backflow from blood that's being pumped out of the ventricles, either into the lungs or to the rest of the body. So this includes the pulmonary valve, which is found between the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery, and the aortic valve, which is found between the left ventricle and the aorta. All right, quick little gift that I thought was cool. This is of the aortic valve of a horse heart as it's beating. So you can see that as the ventricle, since this is the aortic valve, this is going to be the left ventricle. So as the left ventricle squeezes, the flaps of this valve open up and blood is able to move through. And as the ventricle is relaxed, the flaps of this valve shut and blood isn't able to flow backwards through the valve. Last thing about heart valves, the chordae tendineae are some connective tissue bands that are anchoring the flaps of those AV valves into the muscle wall of the ventricles. So these are colloquially called the heartstrings. If you've ever heard someone say like, oh, that pulls on my heartstrings, this is what they're talking about, because they look like strings. Pretty much they are connected. You can see in this little picture here, this is a little papillary muscle that moves up and down to help the flaps of the valve be either open or closed whenever they're supposed to be. All right, quickly, a little bit about the way that the blood moves through the chambers of the heart. So again, starts in the right atrium, which is here on this diagram. The right atrium receives deoxygenated blood from the body through the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava, superior bringing blood from the upper portions of the body, inferior bringing blood from the lower portions of the body, and then the blood is released through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. So now we're into the right ventricle of the heart, the second portion the blood is going to flow through. This is the deoxygenated blood that we received from the right atrium. When the walls of the right ventricle contract, it's going to shoot blood upwards here through the pulmonary valve into the pulmonary trunk, which branches off into a left and a right pulmonary artery, which takes this oxygen poor blood to the lungs to be oxygenated. The fun fact about the pulmonary arteries is that they're the only arteries in the body that carry deoxygenated blood. Every other artery is some branch of the aorta that's carrying oxygenated blood to the rest of the body, except for these pulmonary guys. They're the only arteries carrying deoxygenated blood. Okay, so our blood has been sent out of the right ventricle into the lungs, and it's going to come back through the pulmonary veins into the left atrium. Same situation as the pulmonary arteries being the only arteries that carry deoxygenated blood. The pulmonary veins are the only veins that carry oxygenated blood in the body. So the oxygenated blood travels through the pulmonary veins into the left atrium, and then the blood is going to flow through the mitral or bicuspid valve into the left ventricle. Well, we're in the home stretch here. Last chamber of the heart that blood's going to move through is the left ventricle over here on the diagram. So this has that oxygenated blood that just came from the left atrium. When the left ventricle contracts, it's going to shoot blood out through this little valve right here is called the aortic valve. And you can't see it in this diagram, but after the aortic valve, it branches off into the aortic arch, which is like the superior portion of the aortic artery, and then the descending aorta. And those two major blood vessels are going to push blood throughout the whole body. An important thing to note about the walls of the left ventricle is that they are thicker and more muscular than the walls of any of the other chambers because the left ventricle has to squeeze hard enough to shoot blood out through the rest of the body. And it has to generate enough pressure to get it to go all the way through the arterial system, and then also enough back pressure to come back up through the venous system. So very thick, muscly left ventricle of the heart. So the cardiac cycle is the process of the actual heartbeat. It's broken down into three pretty distinctive steps. The first step is general diastole. Diastole means filling, so this is when the different chambers of the heart are just filling up with blood. The atria and ventricles are all relaxed at this time. The AV valves, so the tricuspid valve here and the bicuspid or mitral valve here, are both open. The semilunar valves, so the pulmonary valve here and the aortic valve here, are both closed. Blood is just flowing from the vena cava into the right atrium and through the valve into the right ventricle, and it's also flowing from the pulmonary veins into the left atrium and through the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle. The second phase of the cardiac cycle is called atrial systole. Systole means squeeze, so this is the phase where the atria are going to contract, so you can see that right here. The atria are contracting, so the AV valves are open to force any blood that was left in the atrium from the diastole period into the ventricle. So the tricuspid and bicuspid valves are both open. The semilunar valves, pulmonary and aortic, are still closed. The blood that's remaining in the atria is pushed into the ventricle, and when you listen to a heartbeat, either on like a ultrasound or through a stethoscope, there are two distinct thumps that you can hear, and that's called the lub-dub cycle. And so the lub, the first beat that you hear of a heartbeat, is the sound of these AV valves closing. So lub, lub. Last phase of the cardiac cycle is called ventricular systole, and systole means squeeze, so this is when the ventricles are going to contract while the atria are relaxed. So there, just did it, there, did it again. The AV valves are shut at this time because as the ventricles contract, we don't want any blood flowing backwards from the ventricles up into the atria, so the tricuspid valve and bicuspid valve shut while the ventricles contract. The semilunar valves, however, open up at this time so that the blood can leave the ventricle and go out through the pulmonary artery or through the aorta. Again, right ventricle pushes it through pulmonary artery to be oxygenated in the lungs. Left ventricle forces it through aortic valve into the aorta to be distributed to the rest of the body. And so the sound of these semilunar valves closing is the second part of the lub-dub cycle. So the second little thump that you hear in a heartbeat. So lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. So we all know that the heart beats involuntarily, and the electrical conduction system of the heart is what allows it to do that. So now the electrical conduction system of the heart is made up of all these different nodes and fibers, and these are not nervous tissue, they're just specialized cells of the heart that are extremely electrically conductive. So the first portion is called the SA node, the sinoatrial node. This is called the pacemaker of the heart because this is the node that generates the impulse that then flows through the rest of the heart. After the SA node, the impulse will travel through the atrioventricular node, which is down here. Both of those nodes are found in the right atrium over here. The atrioventricular node then leads into another little mini node that's called the bundle of His, and then the bundle of His separates into a right and left branch of atrioventricular bundles that travel through the septum wall between the right and left ventricle, and then those AV bundles separate into a bunch of tiny other conductive fibers on either side that are called Purkinje fibers. So this is just a cool animation that shows the pathway that the electrical impulse follows as it moves through the walls of the heart, and also what the heart chambers are doing as the impulse moves through it. So the first part of this system is going to be the impulse generation at the SA node. So the impulse is generated at the SA node, and as it travels down to the AV node, also in the right atrium, we get the atrial systole, so the atria are squeezing at that time. Once the message has moved from the AV node into the AV bundles and down into the Purkinje fibers, that is when you get the ventricular systole. So this is just a really cool animation I found that shows a bunch of different stuff going on all at once. These light up as the different contraction and relaxation cycles occur. It shows about how long does this take, shows when the valves are open and closed, all the different portions of the heart. This little graph here is called ECG. This is what you see on like the heart monitors if you go to the hospital, that shows the electrical movement through the heart. You can see what happens to the pressure in the aorta and in the ventricles and in the atria. You can show what happens to the blood volume in the ventricles, and then this little heart sounds thing. This 2 and 4 are corresponding with the AV valves shutting and the semilunar valves shutting. So this is our lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. Okay, I wanted to touch really briefly on ECGs. ECG stands for electrocardiogram, and so this is if you've ever gone to the hospital or the emergency room or something and they stick all of those little electrode sticky leads to your chest. They are measuring the electrical conductivity in your heart, and so they all have this general shape of P, QRS complex, T. So the P, the first little bump in the heartbeat on an ECG, is when the electrical stimulation runs through the atria. The QRS complex is when it's moving through the ventricles, and then the T wave is the last little burst that moves through the ventricles, but not when the heart is beating. So ECG, sometimes you'll also hear it referred to as EKG. Those are both the same thing. It's just ECG is English and EKG is German. The German spelling of cardio is with a K. So just remember ECG and EKG are the same thing. EEG is the same kind of deal, except it's measuring electrical conductivity through the brain. So all this blood that we've been talking about so far has just been moving through the heart. It's not actually supplying the heart with any nutrients as it moves through the interior. The heart has coronary vessels for that. Those are small little blood vessels that run along the surface of the exterior of the heart that supply it with oxygen and nutrients to keep beating forever and ever and ever. Okay, moving away from the heart into the rest of the cardiovascular system, the blood vessels. So, major type of blood vessels, arteries. Arteries carry oxygenated blood away from the heart. Remember, except for that pulmonary artery, that's the only one that carries deoxygenated blood. Here's a microscope slide showing a cross-sectional view of an artery. Arteries have a small lumen. That's the space between the vessel walls where blood can actually flow. So small lumen on an artery really thick muscular walls, because the pressure in the arteries is coming directly from that really strong left ventricle. The walls of the arteries have to be thick and strong to be able to withstand that pressure without ripping. Okay, the other type of major blood vessel in the cardiovascular system is the veins. Veins carry deoxygenated blood back toward the heart from the rest of the body. When compared to an artery, veins have much larger lumen, much wider space in between the vessel walls. The walls are also a lot thinner because veins don't have to withstand the high blood pressure that arteries do. In fact, all of the pressure in the veins is residual pressure coming from the contraction of the left ventricle still. So pressure is a lot lower in the veins than it is in the arteries. Another thing about veins is that they have valves in them. Because that pressure is so much lower in a vein than an artery, veins have valves to help fight against that backflow. Sometimes these veins don't always work really well, and you do get a little bit of backflow and pooling in the lower extremities in particular, and so that is the formation of varicose veins, when you've got valves that weaken and blood can flow backwards and pool in a little section of a vein. So the remaining types of blood vessels are small ones. Arterioles are small branches of arteries that lead toward a capillary bed. Capillaries are the tiny, tiny blood vessels that have a vessel wall thickness of like 1 cell to allow for diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide into and out of the tissues, and also any nutrients or waste that the tissue are generating, so that it can be transferred back into the blood and then eventually taken through the filtration systems of the liver and the kidneys. And then venules are the capillaries will empty into a little venule that is going to dump into a vein to be carried back towards the heart. Again, just a little bit more histology showing the differences between arteries and veins and capillaries and arterioles and venules. So here's our artery, small lumen, thick muscular wall. Here's a vein, wide lumen, thin, less muscular wall. Here's a little arteriole, has a thicker wall than, say, a little venule over here. And then here is an itty bitty little baby capillary. All right, here we go. Last little bit here, cardiovascular disease. We have to cover this because if you don't die from like a car crash or something by the time you're 25, odds are you're going to die of cardiovascular disease because it's the most prevalent disease in the developed world. So cardiovascular disease and disorders can take many different forms. First, there's arrhythmia. Arrhythmia is just irregular heartbeats, which sometimes aren't that dangerous, but sometimes can cause problems if they're really bad and cause the heart to be beating inefficiently. Hypertension, atherosclerosis, and stenosis. This is the big one that kills a lot of people. So hypertension is high blood pressure. When you've got high blood pressure in your arteries, because your blood sugar is too high, or because you smoke, or something else that causes your blood pressure to be high, that extra pressure pushes on the walls of your arteries, and then they rip a little bit, and your body can sense that ripping, and it goes, oh shoot, that's not good. Let me go fix that. And the way that the body creates natural band-aids is through a really important chemical called cholesterol. And cholesterol, when your arteries are ripping a little bit because the pressure is too high, cholesterol flows up in there and patches those little rips up, which is good. That's a great thing for the body to be able to do. If you had just one event that caused your blood pressure to be too high, your body can fix it with a little bit of cholesterol. But since Americans are all like have horrible diets and terrible exercise habits, a lot of us have high blood pressure all the time. And so when you've got high blood pressure all the time, your body's constantly pumping out cholesterol out of your liver to go patch up all these holes that you're creating in your blood vessels. And that can lead to atherosclerosis, which is just buildup of this fatty cholesterol plaque in your artery. And if you've got atherosclerosis for bad enough and long enough, it can lead to what's going on here in this animation, which is called stenosis, which is a significant narrowing of the blood vessel wall, which is really dangerous because the narrower space the blood has to travel through, the more likely it is to get caught here and start to clot up, which is really dangerous. Because blood clots, we've got this little animation here, you can see the blood slows down and the platelets and red blood cells start to stick together a little bit. Blood clots are really dangerous because wherever they form in the body, they can break loose from whatever vessel that is, and if they travel into your lungs, they can cause a really dangerous condition called pulmonary embolism. If they travel up into your brain, they can cause stroke, which kills a lot of people every year. Another cardiovascular disease, we've got congenital heart disease. Congenital just means from birth, so this is a heart disease that is present in a child that developed while the child was in utero. It's pretty common. There's a few different types that are common. There's problems with the valves or septal defects, which can be, if you've ever heard of someone having a hole in their heart, the septum wall is what separates the ventricles and the atria from each other. And so if you've got a little hole in there, you've got blood flowing where it shouldn't be flowing, and that is a problem. Coronary artery disease and heart attack are also another major problem. So remember that those coronary arteries were those tiny little blood vessels that are on the surface of the heart that supply the actual heart tissue with nutrients. And so again, if you have a bad lifestyle, if you've got high blood sugar or you smoke or whatever, your little coronary arteries can get blocked up with all that plaque. And if those arteries get blocked enough and get occluded, if the stenosis is severe enough that you can't get enough blood through that artery to supply your heart tissue with nutrients and oxygen, then that can lead to heart attack, and that is really dangerous. It kills many people in America every year. Heart failure sounds really bad. It's not that bad, or it doesn't have to be that bad. This is when the heart just isn't pumping strongly enough, and so you get this fluid accumulation, especially in your lower extremities, which is called edema. You can see this here. So if all of a sudden your legs and feet start to swell up like unnaturally puffy, that could be a symptom of heart failure. And then cardiomyopathy happens when you have either too thick or too thin of walls in your heart, and so it messes with the way that your heart is able to pump blood throughout your body.